so much to talk about, as always, in your wheelhouse. But I want to talk about this extraordinary story about the Federal Aviation Administration actively recruiting workers who suffer severe intellectual disabilities, psychiatric problems, and other mental and physical conditions under a diversity and inclusion hiring initiative spelled out on the agency's website. On the face of it, this seems plain ridiculous. Your thoughts?
Yeah, on the face of it, it seems plain ridiculous. I think when you look deeper, it still seems plain ridiculous. Now, obviously, no one is claiming that at this point they're going to hire, someone who's blind or paralyzed to actually fly, a Delta aircraft 30,000 feet in the air. So we're not. Maybe we'll get to that point. We're not at that point yet. But the point is that they have decided. This goes back to, I believe, it was 2013, an Obama-era initiative by the FAA. That they wanted to diversify the airline industry, and they have a lot of several different groups that they wanted to increase their participation in the airline industry, and those with disabilities is one of those groups. Now, what you'll hear from people on the other side of this, the people that are fans of these kinds of diversification efforts, is that, well, yeah, they're doing this, but they're not lowering the standards at all in order to do it. That's the claim anyway. And it's true that whether it's the FAA or any other institution that is putting DEI into practice and trying to diversify, none of them will come out and say, of course, none of them are going to say that we're lowering the standards, but that obviously is what ends up happening. Because if you had the standards set a certain place and then you ended up with like a certain number of, let's say, white pilots, and then you say, well, we don't want that many white pilots, so we want to get more of other types of people in there. Well, what do you have to do with the standards? You end up lowering them, and that's exactly what happens.
I mean, I saw that the new coach in the NFL has replaced Bill Belichick of the Patriots, and he's immediately come out and played the race card, and basically saying if you don't see colour, you don't understand racism and so on. Other black coaches in the NFL have taken a very different view and said all they want to see is football and players. They don't care about what colour they are. And it struck me as sort of a bizarre stance to take because the vast majority of players, for example, in the NFL are black. I think nearly 70%. What did you make of that when you heard it?
Well, I think if you are, if we're getting to the point where we can find anti-black racism in the NFL, well, then just the concept means nothing anymore. As you point out, I think it's like 70 to 80% of players in the NFL are black. The NFL, if you take all the different positions on the field and on the sidelines, it is, black people are vastly overrepresented when you compare them to the 13% of the overall population. So if we're looking for racism even there, then it's just the entire concept is totally meaningless. And in particular, this idea that black head coaches are being targeted for racism. Of course, no, I'm not the first person to point this out, but okay, if a lack of black NFL head coaches is a result of racism, then how do you explain a lack of, say, white defensive backs on the field?
Right.
There's basically none at this point. And are they being targeted for racism? So it just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I mean, 60% of Americans, I think, in the most recent poll I saw, are white, and yet they're not represented by 60% white players in the NFL or the NBA or most American sports. But nobody complains about that. No one says, well, hang on, that's racist. No one would think that way, the other way round. And I admire these black coaches in the NFL who stood up and went, no, of course, it's ridiculous. It's irrelevant. All we care is how good the player is, or how good the coach is, or how good the executives are.
Yeah, and by the way, the reason why people don't complain the other way is that, of course, we know that diversify, diversity and inclusion, all these phrases, this is coded language, and what it really means is we have to make these things less white. But nobody wants to come out and say that. That's one of the reasons why you'll often hear them refer to not only diverse groups, but they'll talk about diverse people. We need a more diverse person in this role. Well, how can a person individually be diverse? Doesn't make any sense. Well, then you understand that what they're really saying is we want a non-white person. They just don't want to come out and say that. And I think another important point that you brought up is that if we are obsessed with representation, if it is very important that every group be exactly represented in every industry that we look at, and I don't agree that that is important. I think that's an unworkable, untenable, unsustainable goal that makes no sense and it's totally arbitrary. But this is what representation would mean. Representation would mean that you have whatever your percentage is in the overall population, that's what you have in this industry. But then you find out that that's not good enough for the representation police, which is interesting.